we're just going to wait a couple of minutes more before we start with the actual session. Okay, welcome everyone. According to my clock at least, we are now on the scheduled time for starting this session. So hopefully everybody who is interested in following the session live will be joining as we are speaking right now. So let me just pull up the first slide so everybody has an idea what the title of this session is. Okay, so I hope you can all see now. The session today that I wanted to speak to is around current developments in AI regulation and the role of standards. And really what I want to do is to highlight a bit what the kind of process is through which the regulatory space, policymakers developing regulations at the government or intergovernmental kind of level, how that process operates, really sort of also how it dynamically responds to public reactions to technology, and highlight the various stages at which the technology community and the civil society community have opportunities to contribute to this development. Where is it that we have opportunities to provide the policymakers with the kind of input that is needed in order to create informed policymaking, really? And an important part within this that I'm going to highlight is also the role of technical standards, or really basically which provide a kind of the technical backbone for how to implement regulation, how to become compliant with regulation. Is often not really defined in specific detail within the regulation, but standards provide a guidance towards that. So generally speaking, obviously, where we are at the moment with the stage of AI development, and AI being an umbrella term to capture so many different kinds of specific technologies and applications that are really just meant to make applications more responsive to the way in which data is developing to derive their specific performances from the data, and this kind of machine learning, but not only machine learning kind of driven way of making smarter technologies. Really, the stage that we're at is that these technologies are increasingly being integrated into larger systems, and through that integration are having impacts on the real world. They're having impacts on the way in which manufacturing is happening, but they're also having impacts on the way in which communications is happening through recommender systems, for instance, on social media platforms, and through that also on things like the democratic process. Paired with this larger real world impact that AI technologies are having, we've seen many news stories around issues arising from these technologies either not working quite the way they were supposed to, or not having thought through the larger implications of what would actually happen if a process is automated, a decision-making procedure is no longer using the expected traditional kinds of way of human involvement. And so this has led to quite a number of news items raising concerns around the impact on democracy, around the impact on human dignity, on bias, etc. And these kinds of news stories obviously are the types of things that start the ball rolling when it comes to legislators thinking, do we need to have new regulation in this space? What are the issues that need to be regulated? So news media has a very important role in setting the stage really of how these people are thinking about the issues. Very few of the policymakers have a technical background. They will be relying at first instance on these kinds of news stories to trigger, is this an issue that needs to be looked into? Things that obviously have come up, issues around bias. Bias is a major focus area when it comes to thinking about potential problems that might arise from automated decision making, because of things like the face recognition being a very obvious use of AI. It is very obvious that prior to introducing AI kinds of methodologies, face recognition was not at all working in an automated kind of way. Now it has facilitated the possibility to do mass surveillance, to do massive automated decision making, or automated ways of triggering a different response for one person or for another person based on how they're being perceived by the computer vision system. And at the same time, the data sets that have been used to drive and build these systems have been severely flawed. They've been very biased, very much overemphasizing white and also male faces, with a lot of examples of how that has made these systems quite brittle to their ability to deal with other kinds of facial features. And so we've had very important work being published by people like Joy Bulwimi, an activist herself, and Timnit Gebru, around how to improve these systems, but also raising the issue that even if the system itself, from a technical perspective, is equally able to deal with different races and genders and etc., in processing them, that would not address all of the issues that arise, the concerns that arise from face recognition, because there's also the question about which communities is this automated decision-making process being rolled out in, who is being impacted primarily by this. Another area being around questions about how the algorithms are being optimized, so not just bias in the data, but also questions about how do we actually define fair processing of these systems. So this was I would say probably a landmark piece of publication by ProPublica around the system that was introduced in various states in the US for doing automated recommendations on what kind of sentencing or potential for parole various defendants might have, the compass system, and the fact that the journalist identified these systems to be quite biased in the types of recommendations that we're giving for white defendants versus black defendants. But the important or sort of interesting part of the resulting dialogue that came up is that the company producing the system actually made a point of saying that they had put in a lot of effort to remove bias in the system, which is true when you look at the accuracy of the system. So the cases where the system was performing correctly, that it was not being biased against one race or the other. Whereas what the journalists did is they focused on the cases where the system made errors, made mistakes. What kind of mistakes would it make? And they showed that the system would make a mistake towards judging Black people as more likely to reoffend when an error was being made by the algorithm, whereas white defendants would be judged as less likely to reoffend. And really what this did was highlight the fact that you could not simultaneously make the system unbiased for accuracy, for false positives, for false negatives, etc., raising really the conversation around the need to clearly define what kind of fairness do we consider to be the appropriate one for a particular application space. And this obviously also goes into the public space, the policy discussion space, because many of these things are not objective. There is no objective truth that says this is the more correct optimization criteria as opposed to the other one. These are judgments, these are societal decisions that need to be made, and as such there needs to be public discourse around this. And the technical community needs to play a role in order to highlight the fact that these are true issues, that you cannot say just make the system fair across all dimensions. These things are inherently incompatible with each other. Another one sort of being, I summarized it by referring back to this paper, which was suggesting that deep learning neural networks would be able to identify a person's sexuality based on photos, based on basically their facial images. And what I'd like to highlight is a core problem that can arise with the introduction of automated decision making, which is that it simplifies reality. In this case, the algorithm was basically being instructed to categorize people into either being heterosexual or homosexual, and not allowing for anything in between, no bisexuality of any kind of type, even though social scientists would tell you that sexuality is on a spectrum, and therefore the starting point from which the system was being trained is deeply flawed, never mind the fact that there is no strong evidence that facial features would indicate one way or the other. Many different problems were raised for this study. But what I wanted to focus on here really is the issue of simplification of society, of individuals, down to simple quantifiable factors, and of course the big question being, what is it that you're measuring, that you're actually using? This comes back also into the discussions around the use of AI for recruitment systems. So all of these things highlight some of the sort of problems that are arising around trust in AI systems, and sort of a need to clarify and be aware of the different dimensions that come into trustworthiness of AI services. That trustworthiness is not purely down to the ability to deliver, which is things like accuracy, precision, and robustness, but also down to the question about being able to clearly communicate the intentions and motivations, the true motivations behind the system. So this comes to issues around transparency, explainability. Privacy is also part of this, and accountability. All of these things are part of the AI ethics debate, and things like bias really affect both of these sides or depend on both of these kinds of sides. So all of these things additionally highlight the importance to realize that when we're talking about potential challenges or problems arising from AI, we need to be clearly identifying whether we're focusing on the actual tool, the technical side of it. Is it because that technically the system is insufficiently accurate, is insufficiently robust, is insufficiently able to deal with different types of data at the same accuracy levels? Or is it actually that the social concerns arise from the way in which the tool is being applied? For instance, when it comes to things like face recognition, to a large extent, people's concerns are not really about the technical side of whether the system is able to perform, but rather whether or not we as a society agree to have a surveillance society. And when it comes to a surveillance society, whether it's being done by AI or by humans, as was the case in the former East Germany, it doesn't really make a difference as far as the societal concern is raised. And part of that is obviously also the question, when people make a claim that an AI system can do something, is that true? And depending on what kind of application we're talking about, judging this can be variably difficult. So talking about basic kind of systems, for instance, ground truth that we can point to and we can say, yes, this is a cat, or yes, this is a dog. The system can directly differentiate between them. But if we're talking about something like job applications, then we're talking about internal states of people. We're talking about actual characteristics of a person. We're talking about a person's intelligence. We're talking about their ability to fit into a certain kind of a job environment. We have no way of directly measuring the things that we're actually interested in this kind of case. So there is no immediate way of judging whether the system is operating correctly. So we need to be much more careful in deciding whether or not these systems are operating correctly. But this means if we wanted to regulate this space and we wanted to be able to provide guarantees around the safety of using these systems, we need to understand that these different kinds of applications of AI actually pose different types of problems that need to be assessed. And therefore, there's a need for input from the technical community to help policymakers understand what the issues really are that they're dealing with. So what does the policy debate, how does this generally develop? What is the sort of general way in which it evolves over time? What we see in that at the moment, or last year, there was about 53 nations had already come out with national AI strategies, indicating that they are thinking about setting in place clear policies, and this can be regulation, but it's also around things of where should investments be going. So these are nations that have already, in a sense, gone through some of the early stages of the policy debate. Generally speaking, it starts with fact-finding. Things like those news articles that I mentioned at the very beginning, they trigger a sense that this is a space that potentially new policies need to be developed for. That then triggers fact-finding things such as parliamentary inquiries, committees, and those kinds of things. In various countries, we've seen many of those committees happening. In the UK, for instance, there were at least 4 committees, both at the House of Lords and the House of Commons, requesting input from the community around the issues. What are the core issues with AI? Generally speaking, presenting some of the directions that the committee was interested in looking at, but asking the academic community, the civil society community, the industry community, and to provide them with an input to help understand what the issues are. So this is an important stage where the technical community needs to step up and provide information. Otherwise, policymakers will not know the correct direction to move into. Then what we've generally seen happen is a move towards AI principles, a sense of we need to establish what are the core ways in which an AI system should operate in order for it to be acceptable within our community. What we've seen there, the core sort of AI principles referring to issues around ethics, such as questions around privacy, avoiding harm to people, recognizing human dignity, explainability of the systems, those kinds of principles. Once principles have been established, generally the movement is then towards things like a national AI strategy. At that stage, the country tends to be looking not just at what should AI be in general, but also how does this country see itself relative to the other countries in the world? Am I a small country that needs to focus, perhaps can identify a core application space for AI and try to become a world leader in that particular one, because I will never be able to compete with the US or China or all of Europe on all types of AI? Or is there a different way in which this particular country sees AI as being of strategic importance for the country? Based on that, where will investments go, but also what kind of new regulations might there be that they want to put in place? Do they want to put in place sandboxes for testing out regulations? This is something that we've seen in some smaller countries, such as the UAE and also Malta, for instance. They've considered themselves to perhaps be a test bed for the use of the development of new types of AI, and in that way want to position themselves globally. Then, once that kind of framework is established, we see a move towards legislative gap analysis. So that is really to say, okay, we now know how we consider that AI should play a role in our society. Given that, does the current legislative framework that we have work for AI? Does AI put in place new challenges that wouldn't really work? Things like opaqueness of a system. Does that mean our existing ways of guaranteeing safety for consumers are going to operate? Those kinds of questions. And then once a gap analysis has been and potential new updates of existing legislation or new kinds of legislation, such as the AI Act that the European Commission has, there is the move putting forward those new legislative amendments. Generally speaking, what is that most countries are currently at sort of the national strategy kind of stage or earlier, have moved beyond that to the legislative gap analysis, and very few, the European primarily, has moved into this proposing of new legislation. Canada has something in that specifically around how government should be using AI, and some others as well, but not that many. So as I mentioned, AI principles, precursor to national strategies, and we've seen a huge proliferation of those happen last year and the year before that. Really, it's in the technical community. Things like the Asilomar AI principles were some of the sort of principles that were laid down, and a lot of the policy community starts looking at these and taking information from there. In the EU case, for instance, we've seen in that progression that I described, they set up this high-level expert group in order to look at, gather information from industry, yes, but also from academia and from civil society into this high-level expert group to get, establish how should these kinds of principles apply in the European context to fit the European kinds of values and those types of things. Technical communities such as the IEEE have also been developing work in this space, ethically aligned design being a document to highlight those things. We've seen industry do some of that. I mean, most of the larger companies have published their particular principles. And then, of course, there is important work happening at the OECD and the G20 around these kinds of things. And in basically 2019, OECD published its AI principles, which were adopted by the G20, and as such have become more or less the reference point for a lot of the national AI principles. And so these are focusing on things such as sustainable growth and development and well-being for humans, human-centered values, transparency and explainability, robustness, security, and accountability as an important one. And then the next column is sort of application spaces of that. Intergovernmental organizations play an important role really in providing a reference point for a lot of the national legislation that's going to be happening in this space. And there is a strong sense at the at the government kind of levels that countries want to have um, a sort of coherent international sense of regulations in this space. There is a recognition that if there is a huge divergence in how one country regulates AI from another, that would minimize the potential for benefit to be reached from AI, because so much of this technology is basically being deployed cross-border. It's being developed in some of the big tech companies, and then using cloud computing, those kinds of methodologies, it is being deployed in other countries. And governments, generally speaking, consider this to be a potential benefit for deploying these systems more broadly, and don't want to unduly break these kinds of ability to operate globally, and so are interested in having global coherence. And so the OECD, but also the Council of Europe and other fora such as the GPI, Global Partnership on AI, have been set up around this, have working groups around this. And these working groups generally are open for input from the civil society, from the technical community. The exact route for doing this may vary, but for instance, GPI currently still has a call open for technical experts. The call ends in 3 days. But so these are opportunities to also provide input into the policy space and raise understanding of what the actual technical reality is of these systems. There is, in addition to this sort of deliberative policy development route that I've described so far, however, there is also a reactive policy development route. So this is basically the case of the technology has been rolled out. It has caused problems. There is a big popular outcry against this. And politicians feel like they must be seen to be doing something, so therefore they will rush to try to pass some kind of legislation related to this issue. And while this is good in the sense that they are responding to what the population is raising as an issue, it tends to not be so well crafted. It tends not to have had as much time to receive the technical input, to receive the detailed understanding of where the true issues arise versus where it might initially appear to be. So examples of this are the face recognition kind of cases, but also things like the use of automated systems for assessing people's high school scores, like what happened in the UK last year. So for instance, in the face recognition, what we're seeing really with this kind of reactive policy is these multiple states and cities in the US that are banning the use of face recognition by the police and sometimes by the public sector in general, and sometimes even beyond that, as a response to the fact that these systems have been felt to be oppressive, have felt to be an abuse of power by the police, by the way in which they've been deployed. This is a space where it is more difficult for the technical community to provide the clear input because of the speed with which there's a sense that a response needs to happen. But nevertheless, if possible, do speak up to the media, etc., as these things are happening to help clarify where the true issues rise. Often what we see is that the true issue is not really with the features of the technology per se, but with the way in which the technology is being deployed. And for instance, in the case of the face recognition one, a big issue is that the technology companies that were developing these tools, basically they only spoke to the police around what are the needs that the police sees in this. They did not speak to the to be surveilled community to understand what the concerns at the community level are, and as such have been rushing to deploy these systems too fast. This is basically what I've already discussed. So as I said, if we look a bit at the process that the EU has gone through, these stages in the deliberative process, 2018 to 2020, the high-level expert group was put in place. This was basically the consultation kind of phase. Based on that, various reports came out, including the white paper last year that identified a direction for an ecosystem of excellence and an ecosystem of trust. This is basically the national AI strategy kind of level. That led to assessments around gaps in the legislative space, triggering or leading in April 2021 to the publication of the proposed AI Act. Now, this was a proposal coming from the European Commission, and given the process that the EU has, the Parliament and the Council, to other elements within this decision-making triumvirate, are currently assessing that proposal and will be putting forward their counter proposals. So this is again a stage where there's the opportunity to provide input. So the Parliament is currently gathering input on understanding what the what the issues are, where the Commission, for instance, was indicating certain carve-outs where the police might still be able to use face recognition. The European Data Protection Supervisor and various civil society groups have already communicated strongly to the Parliament that they would like to see stronger restrictions on the use of face recognition, and the Parliament seems to be taking this up, just as one example of how the communicating between the different constituencies is still taking place. And so there are multiple opportunities as this is going forward to still feed into the system, into the process. I think in the interest of time, I won't go into the details, sort of the elements of the proposal that the EU has put forward, other than to highlight that it is a risk-based approach, which means it focuses on saying we're not going to try to put regulations on all kinds of AI, but rather identify which kinds of AI pose particular types of risks, and those are primarily risks against the kinds of AI principles that were previously identified, things like fundamental human rights. And if it is a high risk kind of system, then lots of regulations will apply to it. But so this is again a question then, how should the risk assessment happen? What is it that creates a risk in this kind of system? These are, again, areas where the technical community needs to provide input in order to make sure that this kind of assessment gets shaped in the right kind of way. The Commission is talking about the use of ex-ante conformity assessments. So that means systems before they get put onto the market will need to be assessed for compliance with the requirements, especially if they are identified as being high risk, as well as post-market monitoring. Both of these, there is a statement in the proposed regulation that these should happen, but there is not yet a definition as to how conformity assessment actually, how to do that at the technical kind of level. Same with the monitoring and many of these stages of what the regulation is asking for. The regulation basically defines what the outputs should be, but it doesn't really say how you're supposed to get there. And how to get there is largely something that requires the creation of standards to help developers of these systems know what kind of process to follow, what kind of benchmarks to use, etc. I'll just move on to the next one. So this is something that we see with a lot of regulation, not just in the AI space. So this is, for instance, the case of GDPR, data protection regulation. But this is also, I'm talking about EU examples here, but this applies equally to pretty much every jurisdiction, this process. So government will draw on standards when crafting legislation partially. To the extent that standards exist, it will look at what are they identifying as issues. But more importantly, standards provide the technical details around how to implement, how to actually build your thing towards becoming compliant. And so in the GDPR case, there are more than 12 standards at the ISO level, ISO IEC 27002, for instance, that provide developers with guidance on how to actually build your system in a way that will allow you to have a high level of confidence that the system will then will be GDPR compliant. And so something similar is true for a lot of other regulation that impacts on technical systems. And the same is going to be true with the AI regulation. And again, obviously, this is a space that heavily depends on input from the technical community in order to actually craft these standards in the correct kind of way. So what does the standards landscape actually look like? Who's involved in this? At the core of this, at the base, we have the national standards bodies. So in the US, that would be NIST. In the UK, that's BSI. In Germany, that's DIN. And I'm not sufficiently familiar with the rest of the world to be able to name them, but every country basically has a national standards body. And these standards bodies, they look to craft standards that would be specific to sort of the conditions in that country, but generally speaking, they look to collaborate together at the international level through ISO, IEC, and such, also ITU, to create standards that would apply internationally. So generally speaking, wherever possible, there is a drive for the national standards bodies to work together at the international level. We see this also in the AI space. The ISO, IEC, JTC1 SC42 is the full name of the standards committee that is focusing on developing standards related to AI. In order to participate in the ISO standards working groups, one needs to be participating in a national body, and the national body then sends delegates to the ISO. That being said, joining a national standards body as an expert is easy. National standards bodies, generally speaking, are open for participants, are seeking participants with the right kind of knowledge to be able to meaningfully contribute to this kind of work. It is, generally speaking, considered to be volunteer work. You will not get paid for it, but it is open for joining, and it doesn't cost any membership fee generally to join these standards bodies and participate in them. What it does cost is time. Time to commit to this. But hopefully, being an expert in the field, you will not be faced with having to do a lot of background research. You will have the knowledge to contribute to it. And then through that national standards body, contribute to the international efforts. In between, we also have regional ones. For instance, in the European case, we have CEN and CENELEC, our European standards bodies. It's not really important to focus in on that at the moment. Parallel to the ISO IEC, there's also the IEEE. IEEE is slightly different in that you don't participate in IEEE standards working groups through a national standards body. Any person can join an IEEE standards working group directly as an expert. IEEE standards mostly sort of rely on IEEE fellows, but it is open. You don't need to be an IEEE member in order to join a standards working group. You do need to join IEEE SA in order to be able to participate in balloting and voting on whether or not a standard is going to be accepted, but not for participating and contributing to the direction that the standard is going to take. And I will be going into more detail on sort of the ins and outs, how the standards communities operate in a later session next month. But just sort of to give a bit of an idea of, for instance, the type of work that the IEEE is doing, and I'll get into ISO next. The IEEE in 2016, end of 2016, launched its global initiative on ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems, which comprises of a number of elements, one being the ethically aligned design, basically thought piece around what does ethics in this space mean, what does doing good AI mean, but also a series of standards. So the P7000 series is a series of standards that are focusing on the sort of the ethical dimension to AI systems. Things like how to address ethical concerns during the design process, transparency of autonomous systems, privacy issues that might arise from AI systems, algorithmic bias considerations, which is the one that I'm chairing, but also more detailed ones such as child and student data governance, etc. And new standards working groups can be proposed. Anybody can go to the IEEE and submit their proposal for a new standards working group. And as long as a IEEE committee consider this to be relevant to the kind of work in this space, and the proposal is sufficiently defined so that it is clear what the scope of the work is going to be, and there's a sense that there will be an interest in having this kind of standards, that there is an industry space or a different kind of space that is likely to pick up on this standard and use it. As long as these kinds of requirements are met, this standards working group will be approved and work can commence on this. And anybody basically can then become a chair and lead a standards working group. ISO, as I said, created, ISO IEC, I should say, created the SC42 committee, which is focusing on artificial intelligence, which has subgroups focusing on things such as systems engineering, such as fundamental standards. Fundamental in this case includes things like terminology, data, trustworthiness, use case applications, those kinds of things. And each of these working groups has sub activities. So within the trustworthiness, there is also an ISO IEC working group that is focusing on bias, for instance, and on societal implications of AI, and on robustness, how to assess the robustness of a neural network system, for instance. And I think that's all I wanted to present. Now I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I know I'm going to have to figure out how to do that. So you can post questions in the Q&A or raise your hand. Or anything else, I guess. Chat is also possible. So if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Okay, so there's one question regarding, are there any taxonomies defined for data usage types? This is actually an interesting sort of conundrum that a lot of the work around starting on AI kind of standards has launched into part of that work without doing taxonomies prior to that. I haven't really personally looked into in detail around the data ones. There's been discussion around whether or not data for AI should be considered different from other kinds of data usages. There's been discussions around the naming of AI or the defining of the scope of AI committees, whether it should specify the use of data for AI or whether that is considered to be implicit in saying that you're doing a standard committee for AI. So I don't exactly know whether there is a taxonomy for data usage types existing in these standards committees. I suspect that the ISO working group has done some work around this in creating a technical report, but I can't really say for sure. So yes, so that's is data for AI different from other data? So largely the argument has been people want to create a new, whether creating the new AI working group, they want to indicate data within that because so much of the bias discussion, for instance, has hinged on whether there is bias in the data. And with a focus on machine learning being sort of the area that has gathered the most attention when it comes to AI methodologies, the importance of data in shaping the model that comes out of the machine learning is seen as so crucial that there's been a tendency to want to put data into the scope descriptions. But generally speaking, whenever that has happened, we would get exactly that kind of question. Why do we need to talk about data for AI? Isn't it just data? And if we put data into this, are we going to be stepping on the feet of other standards that have already been created for data as part of the big data standards, for instance? And we should actually be avoiding that. So there's been a push to say don't put data for AI as a thing. And I think generally that has been more or less accepted, even though there's often the case, but we still need to indicate that the use of data within AI is an important element that needs to be considered. What are the greatest challenges to regulating AI? I think one of the greatest challenges actually when it comes to regulating AI is to clarify whether or not it is AI that we are seeking to regulate, or whether it is that there's a concern that certain domains aren't where we have existing regulations haven't sufficiently anticipated new use cases that might come up because of AI. Let's take an example. So if we're talking about things like the use of AI to monitor and micromanage employees, things like what we've seen in Amazon warehouses and those kinds of contexts, there is a huge concern that this is basically doesn't respect the dignity of the humans working there. And there's been with the sort of proposal of an AI regulation at the EU level, for instance, there's been a push to say these kinds of issues need to also be included in that AI regulation. But my perception on this is that probably this should not be really included in the AI regulation, but rather should be included in regulations regarding the rights of workers, because whether or not you're doing this kind of micromanagement of the employees through AI or through other means is really besides the point when it comes to the question about the human dignity. What you want to have is within the regulation for protecting the rights of workers, you want to state that there needs to be certain freedoms of choosing how exactly you do that work. The AI regulation should be focusing on issues that are really related to the AI, the technology, so questions around lack of transparency leading to potentially deploying systems that are not actually doing what you think that they're doing. They seem to be performing okay for the test cases that you had, but you don't actually have guarantees that they're going to perform correctly for other cases. They may not actually be solving the problem that you think you're solving. So I think when we're talking about regulating AI, we need to be clear about what it is that we're actually wanting to regulate here, that we want to be regulating things that are really related to AI as such, and not just because AI has made certain things easier to automate, that has then made other behaviors possible, which we didn't actually want to have happen, but it is at the core that behavior that we disagree with, not whether or not that behavior is being done through an AI. One of the reasons why I think this is an issue is because it touches on the question about the definition of AI. Why is it that the European Commission, for instance, is using an extremely broad definition of AI in its proposed regulation, to the extent that it more or less touches pretty much any kind of software could be considered to be AI under that definition. In part, that is because they are wanting to include all of these all of these different kinds of use cases of AI into the regulation. They want to be touching on so many different things with this horizontal regulation that they're concerned that if we define AI in a more limited kind of way, that it would become too easy to sidestep the regulation by just implementing your system slightly differently. But if instead of focusing on trying to put all of these issues into one AI regulation, you were to be focusing on the particular, actually the issue, the outcome problem, and regulating for that, then the way in which you're doing it becomes irrelevant, in which case sidestepping that regulation doesn't become such an issue because you're focusing on the kinds of outcomes that are happening. So my take on deliberative citizen approaches on informing experts, politicians. Some AI applications are mainly driven by existing technical possibilities and not whether society actually aims at using such applications. This is absolutely true. And I think this is also the area where we've seen the most frequent kind of cases of popular discontent for the deployment of certain kinds of AI applications, is where the AI application is being built because it can and not because it is something that people have said they actually want or need, as well as cases where AI applications have been built and deployed primarily as a way of sneaking in a change in policies that otherwise would have been difficult to get popular consent for, such as trying to limit people's access to social benefits or to health benefits by automating the evaluation system and using a evaluation target for the automated system that is deliberately set in such a way that less people will get access to those benefits. Deliberative citizen approaches, I think, should play an important role. Obviously, these require a certain amount of time, and as such, they need their primary space where they can operate will be in things like the deliberative kind of policy development kind of space. They need to happen earlier. It needs to be early. So at the stage where initial consultations are being put out, where parliamentary inquiries are happening and those kinds of things, it is important to identify these inquiries are happening and start the deliberative citizen approach at that stage, because that is where the politicians are themselves also at the trying to identify what the main issues are, trying to understand what is happening in this kind of space, where they're most open to being guided in their direction. As you move closer to the actual sort of regulatory sort of proposal of a new regulation kind of stage, there will be less willingness to dramatically change direction. And so the input will become more narrowly focused to just making sure that the way in which the regulation is being proposed is technically feasible, isn't going to have unintended consequences, those kinds of things. So I think, from my perspective, experts informing is, as I've basically said throughout the talk, a very important element, especially in this kind of a domain that is quite technical, that is difficult for many politicians to understand. Many politicians, frankly, go into the debate around AI with the very naive mindset that is basically built on Hollywood movies and the things that they've seen in the news media. And beyond that, they don't know anything about. And then we have the language around AI that is quite anthropomorphic. It talks about artificial intelligence, about machine learning, about automated decision making. All of these things sound very human. and that leads to a projection onto this kind of technology of it being more capable, more human level in its ability to actually do any of these things than the reality is. And so experts need to help politicians understand where the reality actually resides. Do I know some example where AI applications use public open data? Well, the uh, the attempts at using AI in addressing some of the concerns around COVID, some of those have looked to also use public open data around movement of people and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, the majority of these systems have not actually proven to be particularly useful in actually helping us address the COVID crisis. And so, yes, it is an AI application, but not really a particularly successful one. I'm not really sure. It would require somebody to look into more detail. For most of these the AI applications, they don't come with a label next to them that says, and this is the kind of data that we use. So you need to go into really exploring the particular application to find out what kind of data sets they used. There is a recognition that public open data or otherwise sharing of more data has the potential to become quite useful. This is why we see, for instance, also discussions around um, data commons and facilitating of data sharing being part of the sort of larger discussion around the digital age, the digital community. The EU is one case where this is happening. Other places, I believe, are also looking into this, but I don't really have an example to provide in this case, no. At large, there is a general dislike towards slavery. I should hope so. If we keep developing AI systems that are human-centric and that serve only our purposes, aren't we turning those applications into our slaves? Where would you trace the line? Well, I think the starting point for that conversation is, where do we identify an AI system to be beyond a simple machine that is performing a task the same way that our calculator or the Steve engine does. At this moment, I do not see any AI system going beyond a simple machine kind of level. The AI systems are not capable of identifying a new task to do unless the task is being imposed on them by a human. And from my background in neuroscience, I would say I currently do not see how the AI systems in their current paradigm will make that step to the next stage. If we do get to that step, I think we need to make a clear differentiation between AI systems that are developed to be entities in their own right, versus AI systems which probably we should at that stage not be calling AI systems. We should be calling them software or something like that. Those kinds of systems that are basic information processing units that have no sense of who they are and therefore no sense of not wanting to do what we're telling them to do, and therefore slavery doesn't apply to them. I would say this is not a problem for the near future. I could obviously be wrong, but nothing I've seen so far indicates that we are in any way near reaching a kind of AI system with a capacity to know whether or not what it is doing corresponds to what it wants to be doing, because none of these AI systems have any wants. Turing for human-like, any tests to evaluate sentient AIs? I'm not aware of any test that I would say truly gets to the question of whether the AI system is sentient. The typical Turing test is a test of whether or not it is capable of tricking a human into thinking that the system has human capabilities, but that is a different kind of question. Part of the problem is, how do we actually evaluate our own sentience? We don't really know what intelligence is, etc. I have no answer to this one, not a useful one at least. Okay, so I believe that brings us more or less to the end of the hour. I thank everybody for their participation, for the really interesting questions. I look forward to hearing from anyone who is interested in engaging with standards, in engaging with policymakers, and is potentially interested in my experiences in this space. Please do feel free to reach out to me. I believe the information is in the conference information pack. And looking forward to welcoming most of you in 1 month's time, when I'll be giving a presentation that focuses more on the question about the details of how standards development works and how to participate in these, and how to bring out impact from that on the way in which both regulators and industry actually uses this kind of technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ansgar. That was a really cool session.